One of the greatest men to have ruled over ancient Egypt was the third ruler of the 19th dynasty, Ramesses II, who is often referred to as Ramesses the Great. It's considered that he was in his 90s when he died, which was a huge achievement for a man who lived over 3,000 years ago. And he was one of the most successful warrior pharaohs, as he launched many different military campaigns, which mostly all resulted in victory. During the early part of his reign, he focused on building huge cities and temples, and he also established a city named after him on the Nile Delta. But his body was discovered by archaeologists in 1881, and his remains had been moved because of looting in the region of the Valley of the Kings. The discovery of Ramesses II's mummy inside of an ordinary wooden coffin was shocking, but the mummy was very well preserved, and what was found about his body was remarkable. But what is the story of opening the coffin of Ramesses II? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Ramesses II reigned between 1279 and 1213 BCE, and his reign was the second longest in Egyptian history. His family to begin with were not royal, but they came to power following the reign of the religious reformer Amenhotep IV. Ramesses' father Seti I put down a number of rebellious princes in the region, and he went on the offensive, and he waged war on the Hittites of Anatolia, and he achieved some great success against them to begin with. During his reign, Seti gave the crown Prince Ramesses, his son, special status as a regent, and Seti provided Ramesses with a royal household. The young Ramesses, the prince, went with his father on some military campaigns, and he had experiences of war by the time that he would become the king. He had seen warfare, and he would later use this when he ruled in his own right. Ramesses II was made the successor at a very young age, and he was just 10 years old when he was a captain in the army, and he was also given sufficient military training. The family resided in the Nile Delta, and they had a good base for military campaigns, and the house of Ramesses' palace, which was built, had a huge opulent layout, and there were many beautiful gardens and orchards where he would enjoy himself. Following the accession of Ramesses II, his first public duty was to visit Thebes, the southern capital, and he made a state visit to a number of temples. But Ramesses also visited other religious sites, and he was a very pious man. He continued to build temples and expand cities, and he quickly became known for being a great king in the eyes of his subjects and people. 4 years after he became the ruler, he led an army north to conquer provinces lost by his father, and he attacked other rival strongholds. He managed to expand the Egyptian lands further than others had for some years, but he did have a close encounter against the Hittites, and he had to flee at one occasion. But his forces continued to take different cities and lands. His reign was one of prosperity within Egypt, and he had a significant amount of temples built and a lot of work done, and there were large expansions of religious sites. He became known as the Great for his exploits, and he was a constant builder, but regarding his personal life, little is known. His first and favourite queen was Nefertari, and he had many children. But the reign of Ramesses II was the final peak of the ancient Egyptians' power, as following his death, the nation was on the defensive. By the time of his death, Ramesses II was aged around 90 years, and he was suffering with a number of issues, including severe dental problems and hardening of the arteries. He had made Egypt incredibly rich due to the riches he had taken and the wealth he had looted from other empires and civilizations, and he did outlive most of his wives and children. However, following his death, Ramesses was buried in a tomb marked KV7 inside the Valley of the Kings. Because of looting that had taken place inside of the valley, priests took the decision to move Ramesses II from KV7 into a holding area where the remains were then rewrapped to mummify the corpse further, and it was then placed in the tomb of Queen Ahmose in Harpi. But shortly after, it was then moved to a tomb of a high priest named Pinedjem II. This information was recorded in hieroglyphics on the linen wraps of the body of the pharaoh. His mummy was actually found inside of a rather basic wooden coffin in TT 320, which was known as a royal cache. The room contained many different mummified remains and funeral equipment and monuments. The mummy was discovered in 1881, and when the coffin was opened, it was remarkable. The remains of Ramesses were remarkable, despite the fact they belonged to someone who had died 3,000 years ago. He had been wrapped very well, and it showed the people investigating that this was the body of a very high-profile person. The mummy and corpse showed that he had a very strong jaw, and also a slightly curved nose, and he had stood around 5 feet 7 inches tall at the time of his death, and he had presumably been taller early in his life. The man who first unwrapped the mummy of Ramesses II claimed, "On the temples there are a few sparse hairs, but at the poll the hair is quite thick, forming smooth straight locks around 5 centimetres in length, white at the time of death, and possibly auburn during life. They had been dyed by a red light of the spices henna used in embalming. The moustache and beard are thin, the hairs are white, like those of the head and eyebrows. The skin is of earthy brown, splotched with black. The face of the mummy gives a fair idea of the face of the living king." The mummy of the pharaoh was housed inside of museums for many years, but then around a century later, in 1975, further examination of the mummy using more modern methods took place. Maurice Bucaille examined the mummy at the Cairo Museum, and he believed it was in a bad way, but then the French president managed to convince the Egyptians to send the mummy to France to be subjected to preservation and further testing. There have been some false claims that Ramesses was actually issued with a French passport for the journey, but this is not the case, and his remains were investigated in a laboratory in France in 1976. It was claimed that the mummy had wavy red hair, and that he was fair-skinned. Further forensic examination proved that Ramesses was a redhead, and that he had come from a family of redheads, and in ancient Egypt people with red hair were associated with the slayer of Osiris, Set. It was also found on the mummy that he had suffered a number of battle wounds, including old fractures, and that he had suffered from arthritis and also poor circulation. It was later speculated that he may have dealt with conditions in his final years that may have made him have a crooked back. There was also a significant hole in the mandible of the pharaoh, and this was probably caused by a severe abscess in his teeth, which was deemed to have been so severe that it could have caused his death by infection. The mummy of Ramesses II was then cleaned and irradiated to get rid of fungi and insects in an effort to preserve it for many more years, and it was then returned back to Egypt. The sarcophagus of Ramesses II was also discovered in 1881, and it was on here which documented some of the movements of his remains from different tombs to the final resting place, and also it documented much about his life and reign. The body of Ramesses II had been in his father's tomb for many years until it was moved. The sarcophagus shows the king wearing a Nemes headdress, and he is shown with crossed arms and a crook and a flail, and these would have been painted in red and blue paint. The pharaoh was also shown with a braided beard, or a divine beard as it was known. Some historians do believe that this coffin was not the original burial structure for Ramesses II, and some do consider that it may belong to someone else, despite the hieroglyphs stating otherwise. Ramesses II was one of the greatest pharaohs to have reigned and ruled over ancient Egypt. His long reign saw a great degree of prosperity over his people, and his military campaigns funded huge building projects, including large temples and palaces. Ramesses was roughly 90 when he died, and his mummy that was discovered was remarkable, and by using modern techniques, a number of shocking things were found about his life and also his death. But when his coffin was opened, his remains were described as not being in a good way. However, I would dispute this. This was the corpse of a man who had died over 3,000 years ago, and the intense preservation work done at the time of his death, a long time ago, did a very, very good job. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thanks for watching.